The gentle sound of waves crashing against the shore was supposed to be the perfect backdrop for what should have been the happiest moment of their lives. But as they stepped onto the beach hand in hand, no one could have predicted what was about to unfold. An elderly woman, full of grace and wisdom, had just married a man young enough to be her grandson. They were two souls from completely different worlds, bound together by a connection that seemed impossible, but undeniable. At least, that's how it appeared to the outside world. Their love story had captivated the community. People whispered behind their backs, questioning the authenticity of their bond, but none could deny the chemistry between them. She had found in him a joy and excitement she thought she'd never experience again. He, in turn, was enchanted by her wisdom, her kindness, and her undying spirit. They were both searching for something deeper than the mundane day-to-day, and they found it in each other. But no one knew the darkness that lurked beneath their perfect union. As the honeymoon began, the couple was brimming with excitement, each moment more magical than the last. But as the night grew darker and the moonlit waves lapped at the shore, something shifted. It started with small, odd details, strange things she couldn't quite put her finger on. Was it just her imagination playing tricks, or was something more sinister unfolding before her eyes? The night held its secrets close. The air was thick with tension, and with every passing hour, the tension only grew stronger. They had both dreamed of this time together, but neither could have anticipated the terrifying twists of fate that awaited them. And as they retired to their honeymoon suite, they had no idea that this night would change everything forever. What had seemed like a perfect beginning was about to unravel in ways no one could have expected. As she stepped into the dimly lit room, her heart raced with a mix of excitement and unease. But what she didn't know was that the real nightmare was only just beginning. You won't believe what happens next. Stick around, because what you're about to hear will leave you questioning everything about their love. The truth is far more shocking than anyone could have imagined. It was the kind of love that people didn't quite understand. There were those who whispered behind closed doors, certain that there was more to their relationship than met the eye. And then there were those who genuinely believed that love could transcend any boundary, age, or circumstance. For the elderly woman and her young husband, their bond had felt like something out of a fairy tale. Or so it seemed at first. Her life had been filled with many seasons. She had loved and lost, endured heartbreak and joy in equal measure. But as the years went by, she'd felt a growing emptiness, a loneliness that no amount of success or companionship could fill. And then he came into her life, a man with a youthful energy and a fire in his heart. He looked at her like she was the most beautiful thing in the world, as though her wrinkles and silver hair only added to her charm. It was that gaze, that unspoken promise, that drew her in. She had found in him not just a lover, but someone who made her feel alive again. He, on the other hand, had grown up in a world that felt confusing and chaotic. He had been raised in a family that didn't understand him, where he often felt like an outcast. He didn't fit in with the young crowd, nor did he feel at home with his peers. That's what had drawn him to her in the first place. She wasn't just older, she was wise, calm, and steady, a beacon in a world that felt like it was spinning out of control. Her presence gave him peace, and he relished in the moments they spent talking, laughing, and even crying together. To him, her age had never been a barrier. If anything, it had only deepened his admiration for her. She was everything he needed, and more. But beneath their seemingly perfect union, there were fractures no one else saw. Neither of them was entirely honest with the other about the things that lay hidden beneath the surface. It wasn't deception, at least not in the way one might think. It was more a matter of unspoken fears, buried insecurities, and the weight of an unacknowledged truth. The days leading up to their wedding had been a whirlwind of excitement. They had carefully planned everything, choosing a secluded beach destination for their honeymoon, a place far from the prying eyes of those who judged their relationship. The thought of being alone, away from the world, filled them both with a sense of freedom. No one would question their love here. No one would talk about how strange it was, or how people assumed there had to be something more going on. But now, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the stars began to emerge, there was an undercurrent of unease that neither could quite shake. It wasn't the typical pre-wedding jitters, but rather something far deeper. It was as if the world had shifted just slightly, and they were no longer sure of their place in it. As they sat on the balcony of their luxurious beachside suite, the ocean breeze ruffling the curtains, they spoke in low tones, exchanging glances that lingered a little too long. Her mind kept wandering back to the strange feeling she had that morning. It had started small, a sense that something was wrong, that something wasn't quite right. She'd tried to push it aside, attributing it to exhaustion or the overwhelming emotions of the day. But the nagging sensation lingered, like a shadow that wouldn't let her rest. She glanced over at him. He was smiling, his eyes sparkling with excitement. He looked every bit the man she had fallen in love with, the one who had swept her off her feet. But something in his demeanor had changed, just slightly. It was the way he was holding his drink, his hand gripping the glass too tightly. It was the way his jaw clenched every time she spoke, as though he was trying to hold back something. Was it nerves? Or was it something deeper? She couldn't shake the feeling that he was hiding something from her. But what could it be? They had no secrets, did they? They had been open with each other about everything, about their pasts, their dreams, even their fears. Or so she thought. The silence stretched between them, growing heavy with unspoken words. She cleared her throat, trying to break the tension. "Are you okay?" she asked softly, her voice barely above a whisper. His eyes met hers, and for a moment, there was a flicker of something dark and unreadable, before he smiled again, his expression softening. "I'm fine," he said, his voice reassuring, but she couldn't shake the feeling that he was lying. She wanted to ask more, to dig deeper, but the moment was fleeting. Instead, they both turned their attention back to the ocean, watching the waves as they lapped at the shore, each lost in their own thoughts. The stars above were brighter than they had ever seen before, scattered across the sky like diamonds. But that strange feeling was growing stronger, the unease gnawing at her from the inside out. She couldn't shake the thought that something was waiting for them, something that would turn their world upside down. The next morning, the honeymoon was still perfect on the surface. They woke up to the sound of seagulls and the soft hum of the ocean breeze. The air was warm, the sky a perfect shade of blue. But as they stepped out of the suite to explore the beach, she couldn't help but notice that things were starting to feel. He was distant, lost in his thoughts. Every now and then, she caught him staring at the horizon, as though something out there had captured his attention in a way that she couldn't understand. And every time she tried to approach him, he would pull away, his body tense, as though there was something he was keeping from her. It was small things, at first. A misplaced comment, a look that seemed to linger too long on a passing stranger. But when they made their way to a secluded spot along the beach, she felt the shift in the air. "I need to tell you something," he said suddenly, his voice sounding tight and strained. Her heart skipped a beat. Was this the moment? The moment where everything would come crashing down? "What is it?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He turned to her, his expression unreadable. For the first time since they had arrived, she saw the vulnerability in his eyes, the uncertainty that had been simmering beneath the surface. And for the first time, she felt a chill run down her spine. He opened his mouth to speak, but before he could say another word, a loud noise echoed in the distance, a crash, followed by the sound of something breaking. She spun around, her heart pounding in her chest. What was that? Before she could react, he grabbed her arm, pulling her back toward the safety of the suite. His grip was firm, almost too firm, and there was something in his eyes, a flicker of panic, that she couldn't quite place. "What's wrong?" she asked, her voice trembling. He didn't answer. Instead, he kept his eyes fixed on the horizon, as though he could sense something coming, something that neither of them could escape. They rushed back to the suite, but as they stepped inside, she couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had been haunting them had finally caught up to them. The tension between them was palpable now, suffocating. It was as if the world had shifted and they were no longer in control of their own fate. What had been a honeymoon full of promise and excitement was now a nightmare in the making, and neither of them knew how far things would go before the truth finally came to light. But one thing was certain, nothing would ever be the same again. The door to the suite slammed shut behind them, the sound echoing through the quiet room. Her heart was pounding in her chest, every nerve on high alert. What had just happened? What was that noise on the beach, and why had he reacted the way he had? She looked at him, but he was staring off into the distance, his expression unreadable. "Talk to me," she urged, her voice shaking slightly. He glanced at her for only a second before turning away, his fingers running through his hair in a nervous gesture. "We need to be careful," he finally said, but his tone was low and tight, as though the words themselves were difficult to speak. "Careful?" she repeated, her voice growing more anxious. "What are you talking about?" He didn't answer right away, and for a moment, the silence between them was thick, suffocating. The room felt smaller, the air heavier than it had been just moments before. She had never seen him like this, so distant, so on edge. She reached out, her hand gently touching his arm. He flinched, pulling away from her touch. The reaction was sudden, sharp, and it made her heart race even faster. "What's going on?" she demanded, feeling a wave of fear wash over her. His eyes met hers then, and for the first time since they had arrived, she saw something in him that sent chills down her spine. It wasn't fear, at least, not the kind she had been expecting. It was something darker, something that made her question everything she thought she knew about him. "We're not safe here," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "We never were." Her mind reeled. The world seemed to tilt sideways. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice cracking with desperation. "What do you know that you're not telling me?" He was silent for a long time, his eyes darting nervously around the room, as though he expected someone or something to appear at any moment. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and strained. "I never told you everything," he said, his words hanging heavily in the air between them. "I didn't think I had to. I thought we could be happy here, away from everything. But the truth is, I've been running from something, someone, and I can't keep running anymore." Her mind was spinning. She took a step back, trying to process what he had just said. "What are you talking about? Who are you running from?" He looked at her, his gaze filled with a mixture of guilt and fear. "I'm not who you think I am," he confessed, his voice trembling. "I never was." The words hit her like a punch to the gut. She felt as though the ground beneath her was crumbling, the walls of the room closing in on her. "What are you saying?" she asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. "Who are you?" He swallowed hard, and for a moment it seemed as though he was gathering the strength to say something monumental. I didn't come here for love," he admitted finally. "I came here to hide." Her heart raced, her breath catching in her throat. "Hide from what?" she asked, her voice shaking. He looked away, his face tightening with the weight of whatever truth he was about to reveal. "I'm running from the people I've wronged," he said, his voice barely audible. "From the people who want to make sure I pay for the things I've done." Her world tilted again, this time more violently. The man she had married, the man she had trusted, was hiding from something, someone, and she had no idea what it was or how deep it went. "You're in trouble?" she asked, fear and confusion mixing in her voice. He nodded, his shoulders slumping in defeat. "I didn't want you to know," he said. "I never wanted you to find out." "But I did find out," she said, her voice trembling with a mixture of anger and fear. "How long have you been hiding this from me? How long have you been lying?" He shook his head. "I wasn't lying," he said quickly, desperation in his voice. "I just didn't want you involved. I never wanted to bring you into this." Her heart was pounding in her chest, her thoughts racing as she tried to make sense of everything. She had married him because she had believed in him, because she had trusted him. And now, it felt like the foundation of their entire relationship had been built on a lie. "What did you do?" she asked, her voice quiet but sharp. He took a deep breath, his expression one of guilt and regret. "It's complicated," he said. "I did things I'm not proud of, and now there are people looking for me. People who want to make sure I pay for those things." Her mind was reeling. She had no idea what kind of trouble he was in, but she knew one thing for sure. Whatever it was far bigger than either of them had anticipated. "Who are they?" she asked, her voice trembling with fear. "What kind of danger are we in?" He looked at her, his eyes filled with sorrow. "I can't tell you everything," he said. "But I can tell you this, we need to leave. Now, before it's too late." Her stomach dropped. She felt a cold sweat break out across her skin. "Leave?" she asked, her voice cracking. "But we just got here. We're supposed to be on our honeymoon." "I know," he said, his voice filled with regret. "But this isn't a vacation anymore. This is a nightmare. And if we stay here, we might not make it out alive." She stared at him, her mind racing. Everything she had thought she knew about their relationship was crumbling before her eyes. He wasn't just hiding something from her, he was hiding a whole life, a dark past that she couldn't even begin to comprehend. "What do we do?" she asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. He was silent for a moment, his gaze far away, as if he were trying to find the right words. "We leave," he said finally. "We run. We disappear." She felt a wave of panic rise in her chest. "But where will we go?" she asked, her voice shaking with fear. "How can we just leave everything behind?" "We don't have a choice," he said, his voice firm. "If we stay here, they'll find us. And when they do, it won't be pretty." His words hung in the air like a warning, heavy with the weight of something much bigger than either of them could have anticipated. She had no idea who these people were or what kind of danger they were facing, but she knew one thing: this was no longer a honeymoon. It was a fight for survival. As they hurriedly packed their things, the tension between them grew unbearable. She couldn't look at him without feeling a mixture of betrayal and fear. She had trusted him, loved him, and now it felt like the ground was slipping away beneath her feet. She had no idea who he was or what kind of person he had become. But there was no time to dwell on it. The danger was real, and it was closing in fast. They had to leave before it was too late. As they rushed out of the suite and into the night, she felt a sense of dread settle over her. The air was thick with the weight of impending danger. The shadows seemed darker, the waves louder, as though the entire world was holding its breath. And then, just as they were about to step into the safety of the unknown, they heard it. A sound in the distance. Faint, but growing louder with every passing second. The sound of footsteps. Someone was coming. Her heart stopped. The footsteps grew louder, echoing in the empty corridor, and with each passing second, the air around them seemed to grow heavier, charged with the weight of an impending confrontation. Her heart was racing, her breath quickening as she strained her ears, trying to make sense of the sound. It was too late to turn back now. They had packed in a hurry, grabbing only the essentials, and the only option left was to run. Her mind raced in overdrive, trying to process everything he had just told her. The man she had married, the man she had trusted, was running from something much darker than she had ever imagined. He wasn't just a man on the run, he was hiding from dangerous people. And now, it seemed like those people were closing in. But who were they? And why had he kept this from her for so long? She glanced at him, her pulse quickening. His face was set in grim determination, but there was something else too: fear, desperation, and guilt. He had been holding something back. She could feel it. The pieces of the puzzle were scattered, and the more she tried to make sense of them, the more confusing everything became. "What do we do?" she whispered, barely able to keep her voice steady. Her hands trembled as she clutched the straps of her bag. He didn't answer right away. His eyes were darting around, searching for a place to hide or an escape route. It was clear that he wasn't sure how much time they had left. The footsteps were closer now, drawing nearer with every second. "We have to leave. Now." His voice was firm, but there was a quiver beneath the surface. He grabbed her arm, pulling her towards the exit. "Stay close to me." She followed him without question, but fear gnawed at her insides. They ran down the narrow hallway, her feet barely keeping pace with his hurried strides. She could hear the distant hum of the ocean outside, a stark contrast to the chaos building around them. The wind was picking up, the sound of the waves crashing against the shore, making everything feel even more surreal. As they turned the corner, she caught sight of a shadow at the end of the hall, a figure, standing just outside the door they had planned to use as their exit. Her breath caught in her throat, and her stomach twisted with fear. The figure was too tall, too still to be an ordinary person. It was too deliberate, too calculated. He stopped dead in his tracks, pulling her to a halt beside him. His grip on her arm tightened, but this time, there was no comfort in it, only a shared panic. "Stay back," he whispered. But it was too late. The figure stepped forward, emerging from the shadows with a slow, deliberate pace. And then, as the light from a distant lamp flickered and illuminated his face, she saw him clearly. The man before them wasn't just anyone. He was someone from her husband's past, someone she never would have expected to see. It was the same man from the photo he had shown her just a few days before, an old friend, a colleague, or so he had claimed. But now, he looked nothing like the man she had seen in the picture. His eyes were hard, and his expression was one of cold calculation. His face was drawn tight, a mixture of anger and something darker in his gaze. "Looks like the cat's out of the bag," the man said, his voice smooth but full of venom. He was smiling, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was a smile that sent shivers down her spine. "You didn't think you could just run, did you?" Her husband's face paled, his eyes flashing with a mix of anger and fear. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice low and dangerous. The man took another step forward, and the tension in the room grew unbearable. "Oh, but I was waiting for you," he said, his smile widening. "You see, I knew you'd come here. And now, you're going to pay for everything." She glanced at her husband, her mind reeling. Who was this man? And why did he look so confident? It was clear that her husband had some kind of history with him, a history that was darker than she had realized. But there was something else, something she couldn't quite put her finger on. Her husband had been hiding more than just a dangerous past. "You know what's coming, don't you?" the man said, his eyes narrowing as he looked at her. "You've been running from this for a long time. You just didn't know it until now." She didn't understand. She couldn't. Her mind was still spinning from the shock of it all. "Who are you?" she finally demanded, her voice shaking with a mixture of anger and fear. "What do you want?" The man's smile faltered slightly, but he quickly regained his composure. He glanced at her husband, then back at her. "You really don't know, do you?" he asked, almost pityingly. "He's not who you think he is." Her heart skipped a beat. Her mind raced with confusion and dread. What did he mean? What was he talking about? Her husband stepped forward, positioning himself protectively between her and the man. "Stay back," he said, his voice low but firm. "You don't know what you're getting yourself into." The man laughed, the sound sharp and mocking. "Oh, I know exactly what I'm getting into. But it's you who doesn't know. You think you've been living a life of love and happiness, but it's all been a lie." Her pulse quickened, and her breathing became shallow. Every word out of this man's mouth was like a punch to her gut. What did he mean? How had she been living a lie? She had believed in the man she married. She had trusted him completely. But now, everything was falling apart. "Tell her," man spat, turning his gaze back to her husband. "Tell her the truth before I do. Tell her what you've been hiding." Her husband's face twisted with anguish. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but no words came out. He was shaking now, and the fear was evident in his eyes. For a moment, it seemed as though time had stopped. The tension was so thick that it felt like it was choking her. She could feel the weight of the truth pressing down on her, suffocating her in a way she couldn't escape. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, her husband spoke, his voice barely a whisper. "I wasn't just running from the people who wanted to hurt me," he said. "I was running from you. From us. From the life I thought I could have with you." The words hung in the air like a bomb waiting to explode. She felt the floor beneath her give way, her legs almost buckling beneath her. What was he saying? What did he mean he was running from her? "I'm not the man you think I am," he said, his voice cracking with emotion. "I never was." The world seemed to spin around her. She had never felt so betrayed, so lost. She had married this man, had given him everything. And now, it felt as though everything had been a lie. But there was more. There had to be more. "I wasn't just hiding from dangerous people," he continued, his voice shaking. "I was hiding from myself." The man behind him stepped closer, his eyes gleaming with satisfaction. "He doesn't even know the full truth," the man said, his voice dripping with malice. "He's been running from his past, from his mistakes, from everything he's done, and now he's going to pay for it." Her breath caught in her throat as the weight of his words sank in. The man she had married wasn't just hiding from others. He was hiding from his own demons, and those demons were far worse than she had imagined. "Who is he?" she whispered, her voice breaking as she tried to comprehend the enormity of the situation. The man's smile widened. "He's the one you've been searching for all along. The one you never knew you married." The man's words hung in the air, thick with the weight of unspoken truths. Her legs felt weak, her vision blurred as her mind struggled to process everything he had just said. The man she had married, the man she had trusted, wasn't the person she thought he was. He wasn't just hiding from dangerous people. He wasn't just running from his past. He had been hiding from her all along, and the truth was worse than she could have ever imagined. The room seemed to grow darker as the full impact of the revelation sank in. She looked from one man to the other, trying to piece together the fragments of the story that had been kept from her. Her breathing became shallow, her heart racing, as she sought an answer, any answer before it was too late. "I don't understand," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "What do you mean he's the one I've been searching for?" The man who had been pursuing them stepped closer, his grin widening as he relished the confusion he had sown. "You don't know anything, do you?" he said, his voice low and mocking. "You've been living a lie. The man you married is far more dangerous than you could have ever imagined." Her husband's face was pale, his eyes flickering with a mix of fear and guilt. He seemed to shrink under the weight of the words, as if they had become a physical burden on his shoulders. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words caught in his throat. "I never wanted this for you," he said finally, his voice strained with emotion. "I thought I could escape. I thought we could have a normal life." Her mind was racing, her pulse pounding in her ears as she tried to make sense of it all. "What did you do?" she asked, her voice cracking. "What is it you've been running from?" Her husband's hands trembled as he reached for her, but she stepped back, the distance between them growing with every passing second. "It's not that simple," he said, his voice breaking. "There's so much more you don't know. Things I never told you." The man who had followed them from shadows let out a sharp laugh. "You see," he said, "he's been hiding from truth for years. And now it's catching up to him." Her heart ached, and the fear that had been building in her chest seemed to threaten to swallow her whole. Her body felt like it was betraying her, trembling with a mixture of confusion and terror. She had married this man, had given him everything. And now it seemed like her entire world was falling apart. "Who are you?" she asked the stranger, her voice trembling. "Why are you doing this?" The man's smile faltered, his eyes narrowing. He glanced at her husband, then back at her. "You really don't know, do you?" he said, his tone mocking. "You've been living in the dark, just like he has." Her husband took a step forward, his expression one of desperation. "I didn't want this for us," he said, his voice shaking. "I didn't want you to be caught up in it." "But I am caught up in it," she said, her voice sharp now, anger and fear blending together. "I'm in it, and I deserve to know the truth." For a long moment, her husband stood there, unable to speak. The silence stretched between them, heavy and suffocating. And then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he finally spoke the words that shattered everything. "I killed someone," he said, his voice breaking. "I didn't mean to, but I did. And they've been after me ever since." The words hit her like a punch to the gut. She felt as if the ground beneath her had vanished. She stared at him, her mind struggling to keep up with the enormity of what he had just confessed. "What? How?" she asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. His eyes were haunted, and for the first time since this nightmare began, she saw the weight of the guilt he carried. "It was an accident," he said, his voice cracked with emotion. "I was young, stupid. I made a mistake that cost someone their life, and I've been running ever since. They're coming for me, and now they've come for you too." Her mind reeled, the pieces of the puzzle finally falling into place. The strange behavior, the secrets, the guilt in his eyes whenever she asked about his past. It all made sense now, but it didn't make it any easier to accept. "And who are these people?" she asked, her voice trembling with fear. "Who's after us?" The man who had been watching them carefully stepped forward again, his grin widening. "You really don't get it, do you?" he said. "You've been searching for the wrong answers. The people who are after him, they're not just anyone. They're not even human. There's something far worse." Her husband turned sharply to the man, his face twisted in rage. "Don't you dare say it," he warned. But the stranger was already speaking, his voice dark and low. "The people he killed, they weren't ordinary. They were part of something much bigger. And now, they've sent me to make sure he pays the price. And you," he turned his gaze toward her, "you're collateral damage." The air seemed to leave her lungs as the implications of his words sank in. She glanced at her husband, and for the first time, she saw the depth of his despair. He had tried to escape, tried to leave behind the darkness, but it was closing in on them. There was no way out. "You're not safe," the man said, his eyes gleaming with something wicked. "No one is. Not until he pays for what he's done." She took a step back, her mind a whirlwind of confusion and fear. "What are you going to do to us?" she asked, her voice breaking. The man laughed, a dark, menacing sound. "You've already been caught in the web," he said. "And now, it's only a matter of time." Her husband's shoulders slumped, and he turned to face her, his eyes filled with guilt. "I'm so sorry," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I never wanted this for us. I never wanted you to be involved in this mess." She didn't know what to say. There were no words to describe the devastation she felt. Her whole life had been a lie. Everything she thought she knew about the man she loved had been torn apart, and now their very lives were on the line. But there was something else in her heart, a deep, burning sense of anger. She couldn't let it end like this. She couldn't let him or them win. "You can't just leave it like this," she said, her voice rising in anger. "You can't just accept that this is the end." Her husband looked at her, his eyes filled with a mix of fear and despair. "What can we do?" he asked, his voice breaking. "They're too powerful, too dangerous." "I don't care," she said, her voice shaking with rage. We fight. We run. We don't let them take us. He stared at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable, before he finally nodded. "You're right," he said quietly. "We can't just give up." Just as they were about to move, the man who had been watching them stepped forward, a dark glint in his eyes. "I don't think you understand the stakes," he said, his voice low. "You can't run from this." But her husband wasn't listening anymore. He grabbed her hand tightly and pulled her toward the exit, determination in his eyes. They didn't have much time left, but whatever they were about to face, they would face it together. They burst through the door and into the night, running into the unknown, not knowing what awaited them or if they would ever be safe. The ocean roared around them, the wind howling as they ran toward whatever fate had in store. And as they disappeared into the darkness, she couldn't shake the nagging feeling that there was one more twist, one more truth waiting to be uncovered, something bigger than they could have ever imagined. Because as they ran into the night, she realized that the real danger might not have been the man they were running from. It might have been the truth itself.